guys introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Sam Coster. I'm with Butterscotch Shenanigans. I make art and also do design stuff with the three of us. And we don't use design docs.
That's great.
Who's that?
We'll get to you!
Rob Santos, I run Team Pixel. I also teach at Webster and do a whole variety of contracting. Where I've run into a whole variety of different kinds of game design docs, or lack thereof.
I'm Ben Friola from Happy Ventures. I'm a game designer and problem solver. We use game docs sometimes in varying different ways, so into that.
Hi, I'm Ryan Winston of People Arts, and I'm the lead designer there. And I use design docs for everything.
We have a scale here.
Keep you guys separate.
So it said alphabetical, but it was really kind of like, spectrum. Yeah, spectrum. Okay, so
How do you feel about tax breaks?
okay, so I called this a debate, but it's more of a panel. That said, as you can tell, some people have stronger opinions than others. So you kind of mentioned where you stand on it, but do you want to delve into more of why that is?
Should we figure out, should we collectively decide what we're arguing about? Like what a design doc is?
Now, are you going to brainstorm and team? No, it's not really.
Just in case.
Wait, I guess I do want to start there because I don't want to just argue about definitions, I guess. So when I talk about a design doc, I'm talking about a document you prepare ahead of development with the intent to basically limit and build out the scope of a project such that you can actually kind of figure out how much work there is to do in it and elaborate all the systems, that sort of thing. It's supposed to, the goal of the design doc is basically to flesh out your idea for a game into what it would probably be on a systems level and on a content level to actually produce that game. And then I think throughout development, you end up having to come back to it, edit it, tweak it as you iterate on things. That's my personal definition I'm working from. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page.
Yeah, I think that's a good overarching definition, but there are sub levels of design documents that are used for individual scenarios. Like use them for developing levels, stages, those things too. Item spreadsheets.
Gotcha.
I think at one extreme, the way I've seen design documents used is kind of the scope, especially when you're trying to negotiate a contract with a big company and they want to figure out what are they paying for, when it's all this money, and they want to know milestones. They want enough detail to know what they're getting, as well as enough detail to figure out how to segment this project out into deliverables. At the opposite extreme, I've kind of seen them more loosely used as far as what is the agreed upon way of describing things at a given time. And that might be something very small. Like if you're at a point in the project where you are only doing art, if that's your approach, I've seen design documents where all it is an art inventory and just a very small smidgen of what the actual gameplay is, and then vice versa. So depending on who you work with, it'll definitely kind of run the whole spectrum.
Yeah, so Sam's definition is what I had learned when I was in school. Like I read some game design books, and that's what I thought you were supposed to do was create this multi-page, full scope document. And that is one version of a game design document, but my perspective is that there are many shapes and sizes of game design documents. So you can go, full scope, multi-page, down to what I brought with me is just, we do this a lot in Head Ventures, visual game design docs. It could be a one-page with some words and mostly pictures to just get a point across of this is what the game's about, this is the feel of the game world. We also do, in our studio, we do a strict one-page game design doc that is still scope-based, but it cuts out all the detail stuff and just gets to the point of what features are included, what's a maybe, what's pie in the sky.
Yeah, for us, we have the overarching game design document, which kind of expresses the vision for your game and describes the contents that are in it. But we also have game design documents for pretty much every facet of development for each stage that we implement. boss mechanics, so on and so forth, we use Google Docs so that everybody from the team actually come in and work on them simultaneously without, you know, file conflictions and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of different facets of a game design document, I think, but yeah, no buts.
So, you kind of covered this, but I want to hear from everyone. So how have you structured your documentation in the past? And if it was not successful, why do you think that is? And if it was successful, what is it about how you structured it to help make it out?
I'm going to start with our least successful game design document. Was like very, very early in Happy Badger's life. It was like the second game that we had started working on, and we had like these really elaborate ideas, and we wrote a multi-page game design doc before we had ever prototyped anything, and it didn't make any, like, reading it, you'd have no clue what the game was actually supposed to be. This was a huge mistake. Like, you couldn't tell if it was going to be fun. You couldn't tell what the mechanics, like how they were going to feel when you played with them. So it was a complete failure. Like, we eventually made a prototype from that, and it was like, what is this? This is not the game. So that was the worst impression of game design doc, was like doing it totally before prototyping. I think that you have to have some kind of, if you're going to do a multi-page scope thing, you have to like have some sense of what your mechanics are first.
I think, so if we're talking about, I guess the way I usually think about game design doc is like the sort of the first, that sort of that upfront piece. When it comes to just general documentation throughout, like for various design pieces you're figuring out as you go. I guess I wasn't thinking about those in terms of actually like the game design doc idea, because we use that a lot. So we don't ever do anything. We don't do much up front. We basically say it actually wasn't until this most recent game jam we did in October, when we actually had a project that we scoped out on the whiteboard. It was the elevator sim we made called GV Lift. It was the first game we made where we scoped it out on the whiteboard, and it actually turned out to be the same game when we did it. Seriously, it's been like 27 plus games in the last 3 years, and that was the first one that actually matched the original intent almost to a T. And that's kind of where we come from on this, where we iterate a lot. And so we start off with saying, essentially, so rather than doing a very big elaborate design doc, in a sense, we just kind of agree on what the goals are and what the genre is. So I can see something like those initial like pagers, basically. We're like, it's going to look kind of like this, and it's going to be a blend of this and this. And then really, like for the most part, unless you made just a hell of a lot of games, you don't have enough information at that point to actually plan out anything. And like what Ben's talking about is like, you got a prototype, and then you got to start iterating, and then you actually make design docs, I guess, in a sense, for individual pieces as you go. And one of the things that we, like, so the initial failures that we had with using design docs was exactly the same, where we're like, we know how to do this, we haven't made games before, but we're gonna design one right now.
This is how points are going to work.
Yeah,
this is how
exactly.
gamers are going to work.
And it's
You
gonna
don't
feel
know any of
great.
that stuff.
It's gonna feel amazing. And so you go like, here's the plan, and then you're like getting into enemy types, you know, how they move and stuff. It's terrible. Like, just don't even get to that level of detail. I'd say the most I would do for an upfront planning session is basically saying, what kind of stuff does this look like? So pick other games that might sort of pull from, what is it supposed to feel like? What's the main pillars that you're trying to deliver to the people who are playing the game that are going to sort of guide your design choices? So, for example, in Crashlands, exploration and adventure were the core pieces. So that's why we ended up nuking the inventory system completely, because anytime you spent digging around your bag was not time you were spending running around exploring. It's also why some things are really arduous to do. Like you have to actually read the quest dialogue in this game, which people simultaneously will send us a note, right? We'll be like, what? They'll send us a note, and they'll say, man, I love the characters, I love the story. Could you guys put like a quest objective tracker in? And we're like, you don't understand. If we do that, then you don't do this anymore. Like you're not gonna read anything, you're not gonna connect to anything. So having those guiding lights established ahead of time, we're like very strong about saying we want that sense of adventure and exploration to be pervasive throughout the whole thing, is what really helped us sort of establish that plan. So I guess design docs in that sense, where you're like, here's what we're aiming for, vision-wise, I'm 100% on board for it. But design docs in like what we've both done stupidly at some point, not a good choice.
Debate done. Let's go.
Well, yeah, I mean, the definition shifted on me. I'm firmly in everybody else's camp now.
Kind of building off of Sam's, I would say probably the most successful project I worked on that had some sort of design document. It kind of respected the idea that what we were working on was not purely new. We listed a lot of the inspirations, things we liked, things we didn't like. And so there was an intuitive understanding of the idea that it's something we've played before, but it's going to be different because of such and such things. Instead of listing things from scratch, where there's a lot of holes, there's a lot of things where people might not understand. And something we did a little bit different with that one is we did section it off based on the types of teams that we're working on, different roles. Just to kind of encapsulate those different roles and let people delegate and work on their own. Kind of a story about a project that did not go so well. It was basically dropped on my lap, this game design document that was about a 15-page spreadsheet of how all the stats interconnect. So like how the damage worked, the movement, even though we didn't have movement controls, it was this massive spreadsheet basically taking Clash of Clans' equations, as they are visible to the player, and applying it to the Zelda genre. And the reason being, what was cool though was the pages were, you can do that thing in Excel where if you change one cell on one tab, it changes it on 13 other tabs. That was cool.
That sounds cool.
Yeah. That's really cool.
That's fantastic.
And the reason it was written like that was it was not a game, it was a game design doc, but it was not driven by game design, it was driven by sales. This document was what was used to show investors that you could make a game that has all these retention numbers that tweak this way and that way, and it has all these, monetization points and all these things from all these successful games, and that's why that doc was written that way. And so there were a lot of points in that game where I read it and I said, hey, I'm gonna pick different points and I'm gonna start there. There's no way I can implement all this at once. And I said, this document is going to evolve as I implement stuff and as we iterate. And that was my way of trying to save that document, is to implement the parts that were fun and then let fun kind of inject itself into it. Didn't work, probably a massive waste of at least 5 figures. And a lot of people come to me saying, hey Rob, this isn't fun. It doesn't do this. It's not.
You gave me a spreadsheet.
Yeah. What was worse is, then there's that perspective from people who think this is the right way to do something. Okay? It's not fun because you didn't put in all the numbers yet. All 15 pages of numbers. So yeah, that's an example where it's too much at the beginning. I totally agree with Sam. You need to iterate. You need to start with an idea, but you need to find the fun early on. Otherwise, you don't even know what you're working on.
On that note, so when we work with like any given RPG or combat game, you have health and damage are your sort of bread and butter, right? So rather than work from like trying to handpick the scaling of how the levels are going to work or how your player's necessarily going to feel against certain enemies, we build it into an algorithm on the inside that lets us say what's the important question when I'm talking about player health and damage and enemy health and damage. The important question is not how much does each one have. The important question is what does it feel like to fight this particular enemy, or how quickly does this enemy kill me. So our metric that actually ends up cascading into, like in Crash Games in particular, how all the health numbers are derived for all the equipment in the game is based on basically what we call like how long does it take to kill the player. Time to kill is the duration. If we say it should take about 3 seconds, then the game will just auto-adjust all the numbers in the background, and then also adjust what the actual feel of the game is, as opposed to you can't, a lot of this stuff you basically can't plan up front, and when you put that thing in, you just throw a number in there, like 50 usually, it's a good start. You throw the number 50 in there, and then you adjust up and down, and then once you sort of figure out what the relationship is between that and what the sort of salient point is for the player, try to come up with a number that's actually an experiential number, like time to kill, rather than just saying player health. And then when you tweak that, then you can actually make really meaningful progress really quickly in your spreadsheet.
So there's been a bunch of people that talk about not creating the document up front and then sticking to it. But Ryan, you haven't gotten into Did you do that? Did you actually create a fleshed out document before any development started?
No. Okay, so
This is a really heated debate.
when I started on StarCraft Universe, I had absolutely no idea what the hell I was doing. I knew how to make a fun game. I had inherently, a good idea of what made a game fun to play. But as far as the organizational and the logic aspect of things, I was totally inexperienced. So when I first started working on this, I had no game design document whatsoever. I had a vague idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to make StarCraft in space, an MMO in space, and but other than that, I just had a name and an idea and a shitload of YouTube views. And so I brought in a team of guys, and I was like, okay, I need help. I can't deliver on what I promised on without you guys. I need your help. And so we started working, me and this team of, it was probably about, I think, 6 of us to start. And, in the beginning, it was a lot of just trying to, messing around, trying to get the gameplay down. And, so we sort of just created the first 10 or 20 levels of our classes and then some bosses to fight. And I remember it was about probably 6 months into development, messing around with the combat system. We got into a heated argument because we were fighting this Zerg Queen boss. And we got into a heated argument over whether or not all of the boss's skill shots, or all the boss's attacks, should be skill shot based in which you can dodge it or negate it in some way, shape, or form, or if they should have, attacks that you can't avoid. And we ended up everyone had a different opinion on it. And somebody in the group said, "What does the design doc say?" And then, and then Chris, another guy, he sort of laughed. He said, "There is no design doc." And I said, "What's a design doc?" And so from there, I sort of researched, okay, what is a design doc? And I took pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, and I started typing out our game philosophy and what I wanted our game to sort of be and feel like. So I got done with that, and I'm like, all right guys, here it is. It was like 5 or 6 pages long. Here's what I want the game to be like. And everyone just sort of skimmed through it, and we never went back to it again. Like, literally, that was it. So, you're probably sitting up here like, why are you so into game design document? I think that it's important to establish a clear goal for your game. How do you want the game to play? What do you want it to be like? I think that's important. I think that's important to have on paper so that when you go back to that, and you can just look at that and be like, okay, so it'll remind you of your vision. It also helps you, there's a thing called feature creep. We hear it a lot in the StarCraft community. Creep is purple shit that Zerg poop out, and it kind of spreads over the field, and it doesn't stop. It just keeps going. And that's sort of what it's like to be a game developer or a game designer. You just start creating shit. And you're like, oh, let's make this and this because this sounds cool. Oh, you're seriously like, it's almost like you're playing God in a digital world. It's like you're trying to create your own version of another world, and you are the guy pulling the strings. And so there's sort of this intrinsic temptation to continue to expand upon what you want your game to be. But if you don't have clear and defined goals, then you're gonna work for the rest of your life. Like, you'll never get the game done. And I suffer from that still to this day, because early in the game's development, I put in a shitload of features that I'm still refining to this day. And that's why I've been working on this mod for 5 fucking years. So yeah, game design docs are important, but here's the thing. Let me go back to this again. I don't really give a shit that much about the overarching document. I'm more these days about the fine details, which you said you don't care much about, right? Or you do? You do, okay, so yeah,
we use them to suss out like stuff that everyone's just confused about generally.
yeah.
Like pets, like for example, should pets have health? In a game like Crashlands, where you have a companion pet is just attacking stuff constantly, the upfront answer is, well, yeah, of course, because you want them to be able to die. No, terrible idea. It's actually terrible because then all you have to do is like constantly feed your pet because it's so dumb that it cannot dodge anything, and so as a result, it's just dead constantly.
It becomes more of a chore than
It's
a
a
fun
chore,
element.
exactly. And you're like your leash is attached to this dumb animal that's just dead all the time. It's like, that's not the point. I don't feel like I'm going on an adventure carrying a carcass around. So like, that's the stuff where you have to like you do have to come back. You have to say, okay, here's this part of the game that we think should be working like this, but it's actually terrible. What are we trying to do again? What was the point? And I think at that point, like, I guess I totally agree with you that the value, you mentioned everybody skimmed it and then was like, okay, and then threw it out.
Yeah.
I think the reality is the value is basically in doing it,
Yeah.
not in
Maintaining.
maintaining it. Yeah,
Yeah.
you do it and like do it again, I guess, but don't like do it again later on if you need to. If things got really big, but you don't need to like maintain it and don't try to work everything with the dock if the game doesn't want to. I guess in a lot of ways. But.
So I guess in short, design docs for overarching game, whatever. Design docs for gameplay details, yes, definitely. Need to do that. All right, everybody can go home.
You still under.
Okay.
I'm just going to the bathroom this time.
So related to that, Ben, you brought you talked a little bit about it. Can you go over one of your
Yeah.
visual aids
Okay,
and
so
kind of explain
first-
what's going on?
Smallcraft has, at this point in time, 3 design docs, okay? And do we reference them? Not really, but I think each one had a purpose. So this is the first one. This is the visual design doc. And this served, I'd say 2 purposes. One, it's a pitch doc, because this was when we weren't sure what we were working on next. And I had this idea, and I had to have a way of expressing the idea to my team. So that was the first purpose of the visual design doc. And it, like, we pretty much stuck to it. It literally says things like this: driving fast is fun. Driving in circles is lame. And then it goes on to say, things like randomly generated routes perilous with obstacles, traps, and bounty hunters. You're given objectives by merchants, traders, and mafia. You're rewarded resources that you can use to upgrade your craft. Instead of racing in circles, you are a smuggler in a desert planet, running jobs from city to city. So everything in this doc still holds true to the game, which brings to the second purpose of the doc. So the first purpose was to pitch it to my team and see if they were excited about it. The second purpose is to unify the vision so that everyone is on board with what is the vision of the game. And that way, rather than merely having like a couple discussions about it and then everyone kind of comes away from the discussion with a different idea of what the game is, this was sort of like setting in stone with pictures, by the way. That's the whole point of a visual design doc, is you've got some visual reference in here, like, yeah, deserts like this, cities like this. So we all had an idea of what those things would be in the game. So that was the purpose of the visual design doc. The second design doc we did for Smallcraft was a one-pager, and the one-pager is kind of split up like, what's the elevator pitch of the game? What are the core features that must be in the game in order for it to exist? What are the features that would be like nice to haves? And then what are the features that are like pie in the sky? And that purpose of that design doc was really to figure out scope and what is essential and what is not. So we could use that, scope out how long we think it's going to take, and then when it takes longer, because it's going to, we could just cut the stuff at the end. And to me, like, I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately. I think it's really good to have stuff in your scope that is like above and beyond that's okay to cut, because then you have something to cut. Whereas if everything in your scope is like, this is my scope, it's totally trimmed down, it's everything that I have to have, you're not going to get it all in. But if you add some buffer to that, like, well, here's what I have to have and here's the extra stuff, you'll plan to have time for the extra stuff, and you won't have time for the extra stuff, so you just cut that. At least you're not cutting your core stuff, right? And then the third design doc was the one that Sony requires you to have to use their format to write a game design document. And that one was useful in another way, in that it helped us think about things from a different perspective, from a business Sony sales perspective. Like, how are you going to use the technology in the controller? There's rumble in there, there's lights, there's a microphone, there's all kinds of stuff. How are we going to utilize that? that's shit you don't think about when you're initially scoping, so you gotta think about that stuff and like build in time for that.
Great points.
Cool. So,
This debate's getting heated, guys.
so Rob, you've had, sounds like you've had the largest breadth of experience with design docs.
I wouldn't say that.
Well, you may have the people up on the panel, maybe. You wouldn't say that? I'm saying it.
I'll play along.
Okay, play along with this. What's the, like, is there a target amount that is right for a project, and what changes that target amount of documentation?
Playing along.
Okay, playing along. Good.
Here's how I determine target amount. There's this concept in project management known as the impossible axioms of project management. I'll give you a couple of examples. They're axioms because they're always true. They're impossible because they're never actually true when you try to do them. They're only true in retrospect. So first one, the most efficient number of times to have a thought is once, exactly when you need it. It's right, it's always true, right? That's the most efficient. Second one, the most efficient time to plan is as late as possible, right when you need that plan.
Sure.
So these are things you can never actually achieve because these are only backward-looking things. Only after a project can you identify, oh well, we should have waited till this moment to plan that because that's after all the surprises happen. And so with this stuff in mind, you might think, oh, that's stupid advice. It's impossible to act on. But you at least know what to look out for. You're looking out for surprises, and you're also looking out for wasteful communication or kind of stuck thinking, obsessive thinking about the same thing over and over again. I know a lot of people who are game designers. They're great at game designers because they're obsessive compulsive. So I don't necessarily agree with all of those things, but I think it makes for a great thought experiment. Sometimes efficiency is not the answer. It can kill creativity. Totally forgot the original question.
What's our target amount?
Oh, okay, yeah. So really, with those things in mind, the target amount to me is really to view a game design doc as a communication tool. And when is it too much or too little of a communication tool? And this is going to change for every team. When you work with people who are in psychology, the term is a J. Their personality, they're extreme Js on the Myers-Briggs. They love to plan. They love the detail. They love to judge things. That's where the J comes from. You will probably write a lot more. That is the correct amount. Most of my friends in this room are Js, and I appreciate that about them. Me personally, whether as a team of one or with a small team, I am of the P personality type, the perceptive kind, and I am really high on improvisation. And so very little is what is the right amount for me. And, we have talked a lot about the need to define scope so step stays on time. But I have been to plenty of improvisation performances, and they always finish on time. So, I think there is a whole other side of the coin. It's me rocking the boat on purpose. There is a whole other side of the coin, and it largely does depend on team structure, company culture, personality type, where you don't need to plan. You can just be the crazy person who just adapts to the situation as it's thrown at them. And if you are really good at predicting ahead a little bit, not in a document, just in the moment, and you also put a lot of focus on doing a series of minimum viable products, every moment is a game that's worth playing. You can improvise, and you don't need to scope out the whole thing.
I think there's also there's studios like ours that we fund our indie games from client projects, and so we have X amount of money to burn through before we can push this game out and hopefully make money off of it, or turn around and keep doing client stuff. And so for us, not to say that you can't be on time to improvisation, but for us it's really important to figure out, okay, we've got X amount of months, what can we get done in that time? But I think there's other studios and individuals that they're totally okay saying, I don't care if this game takes me a year or 4, I'm going to make it exactly the way I want to make it. And if I have to redo it 3 times, that's what I'm going to do. And that's totally okay too. But for us, like that's where the scope design documents are really helpful. It's like, okay, we can't take 4 years. We need to get it done in a certain amount of time.
That relates to a question I was going to ask you. So Crashlands took 2 years.
Yeah.
How long was it supposed to take?
It's supposed to take about 6 months. I think 2 months in, we thought it was going to take 2 more months. Just constantly. So yeah, it was supposed to take 2 more months. For about the last 16 months.
I've been telling our lead programmer for the last 3 years we're almost done.
It seems like it.
I know.
I don't know why.
So could a design doc help with that?
I'm honestly gonna say no. I think if we had actually scoped out the project, we wouldn't have done it. Frankly, because it's too damn big. We didn't know at the time, so it was very easy to do. But which there's a benefit to. There's a benefit again to not doing a design doc, which is that you can bite off more than you perhaps can chew at the time. But the interesting thing with Crashlands is that the initial thing we wanted to do was to build a place, and that did take 6 months. The problem was then we just had this big empty place, and we needed to turn it into a game, and that took another year and a half. So the original idea did actually fit the scope pretty much exactly, and then we were just like, well, now we just have this. This is the thing. We just can't do it.
We got all the features, and now we got our Lego set. Now we actually
Yeah.
got to build it.
And like the truth is, like Crashlands in particular is extremely content heavy, and Ryan, I think you were talking about it, but like part of the value of doing these things as a scope checker against Cream, honestly, is like in a game that's really big. So say we want to say, okay, Crashlands has chairs in it now. Cool, we have chairs. I want to build a chair. But the problem is this game is 40 to 60 hours long. I don't need to build one chair. I'm gonna need to build like 3 dozen chairs to fill the space so that you're like, I got a nice chair gradient all the way through. There's a superior chair on this end, and a wood chair on this end, basically. And the problem is like if you don't have an idea of how big the game is, and then you start stuffing these things in, which we did early, without recognizing you're going to basically replicate that because you have a whole structure built around it, right? All the way through, then suddenly you end up with a massive, massive project, which is basically what happened to us. So yeah, I mean, we've always been very, very close to running out of cash capital before any project goes live. It's just how it's been. So not on purpose. The first time it took 3 months to make Talfight. We had 6 months of savings in the bank. We just work off savings and then the game's income. So we had 6 months when we left our previous jobs and started Butterscotch. 3 months to make Talfight. It made negative money, and then we had about 2.5 months to make Quadrix Rampage, which we got out I think like 2 weeks before the bank account was going to be empty, and that's with paying ourselves basically nothing. So Quadrix gave us enough sustained revenue that we were able to say, okay, living in poverty, we can continue this until we need to be done, right? So the thing is, like, that's the nice thing about working as yourself or as founders, like you don't got to worry about other people, So you can be like, whatever, I'll just eat Cheerios, it's cool, generic brand, and you can just do that until the thing's done, if you think that the thing is going to be valuable enough at the end of the day. So yeah, I mean, I honestly think, I don't think we could have designed Crashlands up front, which I guess is the whole argument I have, which is that you can't, especially on like the bigger a game gets, the harder I think it actually is to scope it effectively right up front. There's generally going to be like at least a 2 times to 4 times multiplier on what you think the time allotted is going to need to be. I think you can speak to that as well. These things take a lot longer than they seem like they're going to, and design docs help a little bit, but they can never quite curb. Can't quite curb the enthusiasm that we have for putting stuff in these games. So
on my next game, after working on this thing for 5 years, what I really do want to try doing though is design an entire game on paper and go to and try to develop off of that. Because if you think about it, all right, if you design your whole game on paper, yes, the hardest thing to do is figure out, okay, is this actually going to be fun in reality? that's definitely a challenge. But if you're basing it off of existing genres and mechanics that you already work, that's not as big of a factor. But if you're able to do that, then you can almost literally look at every single piece of your game, figure out how long it's going to take. You've got a game plan that's going to guide you through that whole building process, and you're probably going to think about a lot of things before you ever even implement anything that could become a potential problem or could enhance the feeling of your game in general. So this is something that came to my mind when I was listening to Sam talk.
It'd be an interesting experiment.
I mean, when you think about a lot of games, they're prototyped, on paper first. And like Hearthstone, for example, is a great example. That whole game was design docked and tested with paper in the office. They were playing it in the Blizzard office before they even coded a single line.
Sure. So you don't mean you don't prototype before the document is done, right? But you're meaning physically on pieces of actual paper, potentially testing some things out, right?
Both. I'm actually talking about both. And it depends on the genre of game that you're developing. If you're developing a strategy game, prototyping on paper is obviously going to be way easier. If you're developing a platformer, you're going to be cutting out a little guy and like having him like jump around, which might work. I don't know. I've never done that before, but yeah, it'll work great for a strategy game, which is what we're going to do next. But not so much for a shooter.
So I don't know where this fits in, but Metal Gear Solid, the original one, the levels were actually made in Lego before the designing them in the game. So they actually had Lego sets with all those. I don't know how many. At least probably.
Use a little tiny camera to figure out all the camera angles too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's specifically why we built it in Lego, was to get the camera angles for the cinematic stuff, not actually.
Actually, if I could chime in, every time I've ever designed a platformer of any kind, I've always done it on grid paper first, and it works phenomenally. Like it's really a great way to prototype.
For the level design.
For the level design, yeah, for a 2D platformer.
You got a question?
Okay, yeah. So like, there's this D&D arcade game. I can't remember if the first one is called Chronicles of Mystara, but because it's based on D&D, like almost every single game before that was D&D based kind of failed. But this one, like, it managed to make a successful D&D experience as a beat 'em up. And they actually prototyped the campaign by playing it in D&D first, and it gave the players like an actual feeling of agency and like being in that world. So it was really interesting.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, I just think the more planning that you do, as long as it's not static, like if everything is dynamic, the more planning you do, the better. I mean, just think of an architect before he builds a home. I mean, obviously a home is a static entity, but there's all the planning that goes into that. Make sure that home is protected from the elements and that it does its job. And I just think that the more you do that for your game, the better. Now that said, I was in the military, right? I was in the Marines. I did 4 years, and I've been to war. I must say, making a video game is harder than combat. It's harder than war. I'm serious. I'm dead serious. But before we go on a patrol or whatever, we have a briefing, and they say, okay, this is what we're going to do on the patrol. We're going to point A, point B. There's a game plan, right? But there's a thing called frag order in the military. Frag order is basically nothing is ever going to go to plan, and you got to have. And this is like what you were talking about, Rob. Things aren't always going to go to plan, and you got to be able to think on the fly and improvise with whatever's thrown your way. But I think that if you have, that game plan, it's a lot better than going out to battle without a map or without a plan in general.
So I'm going to call you out for a second. Sorry.
Is this where you're going to make that stupid?
This is where I'm going to No. So I think you, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you have the least programming, developer experience of the people on the panel potentially.
Mm-hmm.
No.
I probably at least.
Yeah, that sums it up. Do you
I don't program much.
Okay, never mind.
Just go with it. Play the
so
role.
look, I'm not going to say it.
Playing along.
So playing along, there are people here with varying amounts of development experience. Do you think that plays into the favoring of documentation over prototypes potentially?
No, not at all. I mean, I've actually learned, like, the guy that
You would say that.
I actually don't know if
this
it's
is
relevant.
this is a difficult
This
question.
what?
I actually don't know if it's relevant in my
Yeah, I don't
perspective,
know.
because to me it's not about. I mean, because there's programming, there's art, there's all this stuff. To me, what Ryan was saying, the documentation is to help you plan. And so I think of it as like from a producer role, that even if we're behind on the project, which we always are, the plan still tells me what goals we should be shooting for. In the absence of the plan, we might spin our wheels for 3 months on some stupid thing, but with a plan there, I can say, we've got to stop doing that because we have these other things to finish. So I don't.
Another really cool thing about planning documentation for everything is you can actually like sit down. Part of your game design document can be offering ideas to your programmers of how to maybe implement something. So if you're a designer but you also have a background in programming, then you can maybe offer an idea of how the monster groups are supposed to link to the variables in your experience, stuff like that. That's probably a bad example.
I'm going to agree with you and say that it is relevant. This is, okay, again, depends on the people, depends on the team. This is how I have seen it in practice. Programming is a language like anything, and there was a time in all of your lives where as you were learning English, you probably had someone break it down for you, as far as grammatical structure, but now it's second nature to you. For programmers, the more you do the same thing, even if it's really complex, if you have done it several times already, it starts to become really natural for you to do those things. And so it's much more efficient for you to just fix those problems as they pop up rather than to pre-anticipate them with documentation.
Right.
I think there's a bit of a bell curve on it, where it's like when you first start, you're mildly terrified. You're like, I'm going to design this game up front, full scope. Let's go 6 pages deep. And then after you do that, maybe twice, you're like, this is a terrible idea. And then you just fly by the seat of your pants for like 10 games. And then after that, you suddenly have enough of an idea of what it actually takes to make a game that you can technically do that accurately again, if you wanted to. But then at that point, you're like, why would I want to do that? Because it's so much easier to just fly by my pants. So I think there's a bit of a bell curve on it, where it's like you use them early,
Yeah.
so it's like as an assistant, and then kind of don't, and then maybe pick them back up on to do actual planning later on.
But it also depends on the size of your team, though, too.
It does.
That's
Yeah,
a
if
huge
you got
factor.
It's a communication tool.
I mean, if you got 3 guys that all, like your brothers, I mean, you all probably have similar ways
It's
of
the same
life
brain.
going on. If you're working for, Riot Games here, you got people from all over the country, all different backgrounds, all different probably game design philosophies coming together. You have to have some sort of stone tablet or plastic tablet
That information is disseminated down through the ranks.
Yeah.
There's
And that's
different levels that have to say like, well, this is what the doc that I was given, so we get to work from those.
And that's just corporations in general.
Yeah.
The bigger you are, the more ordered, I guess, and micromanaging sort of documentation you need to have.
Which I firmly believe that the larger the corporation, the less it actually gets done.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
Oh, dude. Oh my god. There's so much I can say about
documentation gets written.
Okay. So I want to go back to something Rob said, sort of. But I think I can sum up a lot of what has come up with, or what people have said so far with. So I work at a place that favors agile development practices. So, meaning, one of the phrases that comes up a lot at work is the last responsible moment. So rather than doing a lot of planning and work up front, you'll wait until the last responsible moment to do something before you do it, which is kind of what you had alluded to earlier. And it sounds like that's kind of how all of your design docs, at least up until this point, have kind of evolved. It's like you saw a need for a communication issue that was going to come up, such as like you guys literally ran into that problem of trying to figure out how to.
Well, prototype.
Yeah. prototyping, but you ran into a problem with communication, and you wrote enough design documentation to get everyone on the same page, so that you could get to the next milestone where you'd write more design documentation if needed, because you're running into more communication problems, or you need to solve an issue with investors, or something along those lines. I don't know where this question's going, but it's trying to sum up what you guys said.
Maybe you do it on an as needed
Yeah,
basis.
it's as needed.
It's a rolling thing.
Again, to my point, different sizes for different needs. Right. If I'm just trying to pitch something, that's going to be much smaller than if I'm trying to like explain mechanics.
Unless you're trying to pitch it to a corporation.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's not what we didn't get into is design docs for clients.
That's what I was actually thinking, was I think putting together a panel, I found mostly designers and developers, but not a lot of, I think the closest to the business is well, I guess all of you running your own business, but you have varying degrees of caring about how much money gets made by what you make.
Yeah.
And there are people that their entire job is to only care about how much money the thing that you make makes. And in some cases, they're going to favor those design docs, probably.
The biggest design doc we ever wrote was for a client. It was a 12-page design doc, and it was for a museum. And it's probably the best design doc we've ever written because the need was there to communicate to the client a level of expectation of what we were doing. Because you can, our normal contract proposal is like a one-pager of these are the features that we're including. But when you're talking about a project of this scale, we're talking like 6 months plus of development. If they misunderstood one of those features, that could be a 2-month mistake. So it was really important for them to understand when we say this feature, this is what we mean, and actually write it out, describe the functionality that's happening, and that, I think that saved our asses. Like having that in place before we signed that contract with them made everything work 100% more smoothly.
So, getting to more feedback on along the same lines, how big of a role is the business stakeholder in the drafting of the design document?
So I think, so when you're talking about making a game, so if you're making a game just because you want to make a game like a fun hobby, I don't think, obviously that's not something to be concerned about, but if you actually think about making a game to launch, basically one of the first things to consider is basically what market you're trying to put it on, if it's on mobile or on PC or both, whatever. What genres are doing well or perhaps underserved? If you want to think about it from an actual business perspective, which is saying where can we add substantial value to this particular area, and then from there allowing your design doc essentially to flow from it. So it becomes essentially a secondary goal besides the game itself just being really cool and providing this sense of fun and exploration. Whatever. It can be this thing where it's like also it's cross-platform, or it's on PS4, and it's the first game on PS4 that uses their VR headset, or whatever. And I think you obviously would make a completely different game depending on those business strategies that you're trying to use there. So we think of games as each individual game as a tool that is doing a particular thing for our studio, and even our game jam games. So all of those we've used in particular to do a thing. So Narwhal Online was our first go at our back-end bScotch ID multiplayer system. We built that weekend and expanded on it. We continue to expand on it. Our last one, Do You Even Lift, was actually the first one that all three of us got to work together in more of a functional 3-person game design and programming team capacity. So we use each one as a tool. And I think thinking about like that, where you say essentially where I'm at as a studio and what does my studio need right now, and then using that to also inform your game design is really, really important. And a lot of people don't really do that. They just say, I want to make a space shooter, so I'm going to do that. And that's a fine way to do it if you're doing it as a hobby, sure. But if you want to use it to start kind of putting the blocks down in the sand and building a bit of a fort for yourself, then you have to think with actually a bit more of a planned mindset, I guess.
Actually, I was thinking about this, the business stakeholder question. You did a design doc for business stakeholders, maybe without realizing it, when you put together your Kickstarter. Mm-hmm. Was that before or after development had started?
Oh, wait, when we did the Kickstarter, it was way after.
It was way after, okay. So did that help firm together the vision?
Yes.
For what you wrote?
Yeah, I'd say it definitely did. It was the first time I really sat down and said, okay, what's all in the game? What's the game going to be about? And describe it in detail to the end users. So, yeah.
Rob, what about you? You've had business stakeholders hand you a design document.
Yeah.
But is your design document a target for those types of people?
So I think, and this is true of any organization that gets too big, sometimes the money is no longer attached to the people who are actually going to enjoy the product. You know, and so there definitely is a danger where something that looks great or sounds great to investors is divorced from the actual enjoyment of the game. So sometimes it does completely fall apart at that stage, you know, before there is even a game. I think it's definitely important to kind of have it at the heart of your project that good business is enjoyment and awareness for the end consumer. Not just enjoyment, you know, making a good game. Awareness is important too, because if no one knows about a good game, then it's not a business. So they both have to be factored in, but it does have to be about the end player.
And just think of how microtransactions can totally just tear apart the mechanics of your game. So knowing what kind of business model you want for your game before you even start developing it is huge.
I did want to mention something which we Seth and I chatted about earlier today, because when you make so we're talking about game design docs, which is essentially saying, I'm human, I'm the person who's making this game, I'm going to tell it how it needs to be, right? I'm going to plan that out. When you work on a bigger project, I guess really if you work on any game project, there's an important aspect which is actually the reverse channel of that, which is the game. You oftentimes need to actually put tools into the game or put output in the game that lets the game tell you where its deficiencies are. The easiest way to do that, of course, is to bring in someone to test it, to watch them struggle desperately with the game you've made. But an interesting way where this can, like where you actually literally need the game to tell you what it's doing, came to us in Crashings, because there's so much crap in the damn game. It's like 500 craftable items, and there's thousands of bits of things for you to pick up. And so the question we had was, where are we having resource drops? So for example, if I play through the whole game, I'm going to end up with like 7,000 pieces of this particular resource because we don't have a sink for it in the game. There's nothing that you craft using the resource. And as much as you want up front to like design every single item and all that stuff, you're basically going to miss things because you're a person. And so we try to actually focus now also on building tools that let the game tell us sort of where the design holes are at the end of the day, and usually outside of an actual feedback system from other players. It can be really important for finding balance issues and stuff like that.
So I want to figure out how to phrase a question about the role of designer. Like, if you work on a team with somebody who plays the role of designer, does that cause the necessity of a design document to increase because of the need for that person to communicate ideas to the team and kind of fill up time with trying to fill in all those details? Or does anyone not have enough context to answer that?
I don't think it necessarily necessitates a design doc. It just necessitates communication. And if that communication takes the form of a design doc because that works for that team, then great. But it can take the form of a task list or of a Slack channel or swim lane. So there's a lot of different ways that you can communicate, scope and ideas and that kind of planning communication. And like the design doc does play a nice role of being very detailed when it needs to be, but like we don't use it for that. Like if we need to discuss details, like I'll sit with our programmer and we'll play test together and talk about it. That's how we approach each other.
But do you have a role of designer, or is it
I'm
a shared thing?
I'm pretty much the game designer.
Okay.
I was doing some development in the early stages. I do like back-end server stuff, but it's gotten like so far beyond my Unity skills that like I can't really touch the game anymore. So yeah, like I'm the lead playtester.
Okay. So I'm not gonna. So I want to run into problems where I have had issues with communication. So at past game jams, I've had 2 times when things have totally just run off in a direction that kind of wasn't part of the plan, and we've had to kind of course correct in order to fix that. I think maybe pretty much every game. So,
Real teammates.
pretty much, yeah, every project. So, so in one case there was a writer that, or I'm thinking specifically of 2 games that I have noted. There was a writer that we had kind of an idea to have like an interactive like story, and what ended up happening was the writer didn't really get how to implement that, so they just made like a branching story. So we kind of evolved the game to meet that. And in another case, we made a game around level design that facilitates a certain type of thinking, and the level designer didn't really understand how to make levels that took advantage of that like concept. And in that case, we hired an outside consultant who sat down and worked with that person to help make a few levels and kind of get the flow going.
During a game jam.
During a game jam.
You hired an outside.
It's a metaphor. Had somebody come in and like work with them.
For cookies and pizzas.
Yeah, the problem ended up in someone else's hands, so I didn't have to deal with it. So, where did I go wrong? Like, could a document have solved this problem? Like, what sorts of things, what tools could I have used, or we as a team used, to make sure that everyone kind of stayed on the same page?
I think it's a combination of the what, the why, and the how. It's taking your idea, getting it down into game form, and in order to really do that and make sure that you have a cohesive flow, I think that it's super important. You first design on paper, but then the second most important thing is to bring people in and sit down and explain the reasons why you're doing everything. Because oftentimes we have the temptation to say, okay, this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to do it, but we don't say why we're do it or why we do it this way. And when people don't understand why something is going to be done a certain way, sometimes they have almost an inherent drive to rebel against it, or want to do something else, or take things in a different direction because they don't understand and they're not all on the same page. So I think that like when I'm designing for StarCraft Universe, what I do is I've got everything in a Google Doc, and I have my design down on paper, and then I bring my guys in. I say, all right guys, have a look over this, we read through it together, and if there's any issues there, we talk about them, we address them, we change them if we need to change them, and then we take everything from being black text to purple text. Purple text means that everything that's said here is going to go into the game, and then the programmers, they'll start putting it into the game, and when something's being worked on, it's yellow, and then when it's actually in the game and it's ready to be tested and prototyped, then it's green. And so I think that having everybody part of every facet of your game's development is super important to having good communications. It's obvious. But when people, I feel like when games are the development is compartmentalized, people feel like they're being left out, or they don't understand something, or they're not involved. I mean, even if you have somebody who sucks at game design, but they're a great programmer, bring them in to talk about the design process, because it's important to know if there's going to be any problems with actually implementing this, are there going to be any system conflictions with this idea, so on and so forth. So I think I might be rambling now. I don't remember the original question anymore.
I mean, I think in the case, you have to identify whether it's whether the cause of the block is from basically ignorance or incompetence, right? So, because there's a difference between the two. So one is that I can't figure out how to do something because I just don't know how to do it. So a very good example of this, and I guess the response to both of them is the same, which is actually you have to choose: are we going to work around it and just say, okay, this is part of our constraints now? A good example of that is when Seth was trying to build the world for the first time. It took 7 minutes to generate and 4 minutes to walk across the whole thing. So we're like, we're gonna have an infinite world, and then you're like, 6 minutes left, and then you get it and you just walk over there and it's done. But the funny thing was, it showed this to me and he was super bummed, and I was like, we'll just call it Four Corners. Make a game called Four Corners. The game's called Four Corners for about 3.5 months until this thing got figured out. So it's like, you basically can change the game design based on the constraints you come up with. Like some of them are technical constraints. And sometimes you don't have the time to say, all right, we need to figure out how to build an infinite world now in a game jam where we've never done it before. So like, it's not gonna be a thing. So you have to work with the constraints. Other times, you basically decide, okay, this is actually what we're gonna put basically R&D time into, and you push through it, and then knock that constraint out of the way. Because constraints are always temporary choices, essentially, as to whether or not you embrace them or reject them and try to work past them. And when it comes to the more of like not knowing, having someone who can't figure out how to do a thing, essentially it's just a question of like, it's a teaching problem, right? But it is actually the same problem. It's like, do we teach this person how to do it and take the time investment there, which if you're working with people, you generally want to do. Game jams are hard for this because it's a 2-day love affair and that's it. So you're like, oh, whatever. I'll just hire a consultant to come and do your job. So that, you can basically choose to just route around them. I would say in a normal work context, you obviously want to teach. But in those cases, the choice is always the same, which is do you work around or do you put the time in to actually bust that constraint out forward?
I think this is, I meant to bring this up earlier when Ryan brought up architecture. I mean, this is a good example to bring up emergent game design also, kind of another variation of improvisational design. When Ryan talked about architecture, your example was that you have to plan all those things so that the building comes together the way it should, right? A complete and safe building. The thing is, another way to look at it though, is that the universe is complex, it is interconnected, but it's also fun, and depending on your theological views, you may think that it was predetermined to be that fun way, or you may think that it is just emergently fun, that all these independent systems that create the universe create a good life, and in many ways, a lot of games are being designed that way now, where they start with one system, it's fun, and then they say, let's try a bunch of things, and a bunch of those things will not be fun, but maybe one out of 50 will be, and they'll add that, and it kind of interweave, all these systems, and it's kind of like your description of working with constraints. Adopt a constraint, ignore the incompetence. Kidding, Seth. Sometimes it is possible to just go with it, and given enough layers, you can actually end up with something very complex and also very tightly woven without replanning it, and with it actually looking like a failure, a failure of something else.
Cool. Well, I have a million more questions, but we've been here for an hour, and I feel like we should probably get you guys involved. So, Tim?
So I guess it's more of a anecdote slide question. So I guess the concern I have is when I came in talking about design, I think I had the same idea as that. It's this overarching, it's like the dictionary. You show up at work the first day and say, here's what we're doing. It's done. And you might make a few adjustments here or there. And I've done that in the past, and it sucks.
Yeah.
Whereas now, especially with my current tool set and my current experience, it's, for me, internally, a million times easier to sit down and say, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do a bunch of stuff and know in my head, oh, I'm doing all this stuff. The thing is done. It's quicker and faster for me to not actually document anything I'm doing, because I feel like the time it takes me to do that, I'm not doing actually work. Where that comes into problems is when you're working with other people, and they don't know what you're doing, they don't know what you're planning to do, and they don't know what needs to be done without some kind of overarching thing. So, going back a year ago, working on a big project, a pretty big project with somebody, not gonna name names, and we would go and have dinner, and we would sit at dinner for 4 hours and be like, this is what we're gonna do for the next stage of development. This needs to change, and this needs to be like this, and then we would just write and sketch it, go back. Nothing that could be read, nothing legible. We just have drawings and boxes on graph paper everywhere. And I'd go home, and I think they were working on certain things. I think I would go home and spend the entire weekend no sleep, hammer out one piece of these 10 things we talked about. I know I need to do these other 9 things. I know I want to get this thing done first. Monday morning, show it off. Look at this thing, I did this, it's awesome, it's pure perfect. And then immediately the question would come in, well, what about this we talked about? What about this? What about this? What about this? And it's like, well, I haven't gotten to those, or I thought we talked about not doing that, or thought we talked about doing this instead, you know, and then by the end of the day, I'm frustrated with, I thought I achieved something over the weekend by doing this piece of the puzzle, and he didn't look at that. He wasn't concerned. It was like, what about the other things we already talked about? Where are those things at? Why aren't they done? So I guess the question is, where's the balance of how much time do I spend making sure that everyone is on the same page versus, you know, is it a document or is it like you're talking about like other like I would consider those to be documents, but not the design document. So I don't know where that balance is.
I think it's at the point where you guys feel that there's an agreement on the touch point. So like, let's take this concept to the extreme. Suppose crowdsourced games. How do you maintain complete understanding in a project where the participants are totally open-ended? How does crowdsourcing work? You know, open source stuff. And the reason that has been so successful, number one, is that there's a curation phase. You know, you have pull requests. Basically, people write code, and then the person who's in charge of maintaining that code base gets to verify, is this actually going to come in? So I think there does need to be a director curatorial perspective. The reason open source has worked, or the times that it does work, is when people work with encapsulation, which is different from compartmentalization, where you kind of silo yourselves off. Encapsulation is kind of like the black box concept in programming, where you don't necessarily care how it's done, you care about the interfaces, how things connect. And so I think when you're working with anyone, if at least you can say, hey, art style or whatever, totally up to you, but it has to be, you know, it has to be raster, not vector. You know, agreements like that, size, the specific list of points. I think if you can nail those touch points down, you'll still be able to give someone the freedom to jump in and do their own unique thing.
I mean, I think there's also misunderstanding just as far as what your work actually is. So we get aggravated about this from time to time too, because you send emails, you have to talk to people, talk to your customers, and you know, send emails and about PR stuff, all that stuff. You're not doing work on a game during that time, but you're doing extremely important work during that time. So I guess when it comes to this idea of like essentially documentation or essentially management, whether it's shared or whether it's a central sort of hierarchical management, that is actually a huge part of getting a game done and completed. So like we started using Kit Kanban, which is great for a Kanban board for taking care of workflow problems and stuff like that. So basically, what that does is it allows you, that we had the same, roughly similar issue where like everyone's doing a ton of different things simultaneously, and we actually have no idea what anybody's doing at any given time. And the volume of that went up so high that we were starting to get duplicate requests. We'd be like, hey, did you get this art piece done yet? I'm like, yeah, it's been done for 3 days, it's in the Dropbox, you know, you can have it. Or we'd be like, oh, did you send this interview off? And we'd be like, yeah, I sent it off 2 days ago, what's the problem? So we needed a way to keep track of everybody's stuff, but not in a micromanagement sort of way. You know what you want to avoid. So Kanban lets you do that with like a card-based system. So you see all of the work on the board.
Right. Like Trello.
Yeah, it's kind of Trello, yeah. And then you can watch it go through. And that does work really well if you're having issues with knowing what people are up to and what their sort of importance is, and whether or not you can head that off at a bad pass, then you need a better system to handle that communication stuff.
I think very simply, it's a matter of communicating and managing expectations. Whether that's a 2-person team or a 10-person team, you can have expectations of yourself and of each other. And so it's great to talk about like, here's all the features that we're gonna work on next. We're gonna prioritize them and label them and all that stuff. But at some point you say, okay, I think feature 1 will take me a week. Feature 2 will take me 2 days. And that way those expectations are set. And that way if you're not meeting those expectations, then you have a conversation of, well, it's taking longer because, versus why isn't that done?
Right.
To get back to your original question, I think what happened to you just sounds like a really simple breakdown in communication with me, and I think that having like a Google Cloud, Docs, where you say, okay, anything that goes on this page, we're putting in the freaking game, and that's the way it is. Like having that solid agreement rather than writing shit down on napkins while you're at dinner is probably like a good way to go.
We use what's called swim lanes to manage expectations, like who's doing what, kind of like the same thing. everyone's doing all these different things, and a lot of times you may not be aware of what other person is doing. And sometimes you don't need to know, but you should have a place of reference. And so if someone says, here's me, here's you, here's the other person on the team. This week, Tim's doing this, Ben's doing this, Rob's doing this. Next week, Tim's still doing this, because that takes a long time. Rob's doing a new thing, Ben's doing a new thing. Next week, and that way, at any given time, you can check and see where you're supposed to be, or check and see where someone else is supposed to be.
And to know that something wasn't forgotten there, that's something.
And it's, again, that brings the, it allows the conversation of, I'm delayed because we forgot to add this. But then it's at least we're on the same page of why you're delayed, and not like, come on, why isn't this thing done yet?
Say it's okay. You guys have all done contract work, or maybe you still are doing contract work. In order to determine very early on in a contract, how much it's going to cost. Well, you got to come up with a figure somewhere along the line. How long it's going to take you? How many people you're going to need to do? How you're going to spread the workload out? All that kind of stuff. Don't you need a game document with some detail to create so you can come up with that in the first place? A high level.
Depending on what facet of game design you're talking about, it could be more or less complex. But yeah, it's definitely important.
I think in an ideal world, yes. Like in an ideal world, your client pays you to sit down, brainstorm with them, and you write the document together. This has happened one time in our entire 6-year career of our company where this ideal scenario happened, and it was beautiful. Every other time, you have to spend your own time and hours trying to think of what the client probably needs, and then trying to think of how long that's going to take you to do, and that's nice.
And because of that situation, I actively reject contracts that are that big. I will push them to say, hire me for this piece, and you can hire me again for the next piece, kind of sequential hiring, under the agreement that we plan the stuff as close as possible to when it's actually needed, so we avoid a lot of that potential where something takes 10 times longer, but I'm still getting paid a tenth of what the actual effort ended up being.
Breaking stuff into chunks or phases is a great way to remediate that.
Kind of what Ben was talking about earlier about you kind of touched on nailing down how long one feature will take, another will take. What do you guys think is a good balance in terms of feeling constrained because, I'm out of time for this, I can't leave any more time on it, I really need to spend more time, and kind of at close to the beginning saying, okay, these are, so you all have different kind of views on how the design document should work, so this will obviously make your answer, in terms of saying okay, I need to get the physics engine down. I think this will take me this long. And then when you get to that point, is that, where do you think the balance is in terms of how hard those deadlines need to be, where you say, okay, I need to leave this and move on because I'm running out of money or I'm running out of time or some other constraint?
Your guy doesn't shoot off into space anymore, your physics engine is in a good spot.
Unless it's supposed to do that, then.
Well, I think, the first thing is frankly, if you're building a physics engine.
Okay. It was just an example.
Okay, good. Well, God, do not do that. So the question basically becomes, if I want to build a cool feature and I think it'll take X amount of time and it starts taking more, where do I put a hard line on that? I think basically the problem is, and this is where the priority ordering comes in, and Robbie touched on a little bit with the minimum viable product idea, where you say, what do we have to have in to make this into something that will work? Get those in first, and you have to let them take however long they're going to take, basically. And then the question kind of comes in okay, how far can we push this given the amount of time we have left to burn on this? Because you really shouldn't, the first kind of couple aspects of your game, the first core of your game should never ever push you into the red zone or danger territory for getting the game done, if that makes sense. If that's the case, then you have really, really overshot what the core of the game was and how you might be able to stretch that. So, because there's also all sorts of things you can do. If you're making an RPG and you're we just don't have enough time to make all the content, turn it into a roguelike, right? Boom, done. Make if you want to spend 10 minutes.
Working with constraints.
Yeah, working with constraints. So, and it's a lot of indies do that because it's too hard to make all the content like that. So, there's plenty of ways to cut around it, but the reality is like the core of a game is usually a pretty small piece actually. Your crashes, it's like you're clicking on stuff. We're not clicking on stuff. And certain mechanics require a certain amount of like content to make them go. And so being kind of keen up front about how much content a particular mechanic is going to require that is your core is I think the way to kind of avoid that. But it should never be the case that the main thing your game focuses on is dangerous for you to do from a development standpoint. It should be the extra stuff where you're like multiplayer or VR headsets ×3.
So Sam, you were talking about how you kind of shy away from some of the design documents that some of the other guys up here were talking about. Now, one of those aspects of design documents I would assume would be kind of getting an idea of how long different features will take, so you can kind of estimate how long games will take.
Sure.
Has that caused problems with you with development in terms of maybe not having a good idea of how long features will take, so you end up flowing into another feature's time?
So I think our first 2 games we had such a narrow timeline on because we had 6 months before money was gone that we were vicious when it came to cutting stuff out. So Quadrupus Rampage, for example, we don't estimate feature time. We say what do we need to have in here, and then once it's done, it's like okay, how much time we got before we need to launch this thing, pack other things in. Quadrupus, for example, we didn't put the boss in, who's now like the reason why people play the game, Pete. We didn't put him in until 4 days before we launched the game. Because we got back from a reviewer and he was like, hey, this is really fun, but it's pointless. And we were like, oh, shit. So in an afternoon, we just like, oh, just drew this guy and stuff, coded it up, and we were done. And so it's sort of thing like we didn't put that in the original plan, but suddenly it had to be done before the 4 days were done, right? And that was like a no joke situation, and so you should get it done. But like, I mean, like I said, I think it really should be the case that the core of your game should never be a huge thing, if that makes sense. We kind of ran into that with Crashlands, actually. The problem with that game was basically the fact that the core of it was freaking huge because it's a crafting game. Crafting games are enormous. They always are because they're content heavy. Simulation games also can easily creep in that territory. So I'd say know your game type and what amount of stuff is going to be required to get it to go at a basic level, and then go from there.
I think the more you do it, the more you'll develop an eye for what scales down or scales up, which is why game jams are so important. But on any project, there is going to be an item that's on what's called the critical path. This is the item that no matter how you arrange it, this is the thing that if this takes longer, the whole thing will take longer. There are some things where you'll have extra time because they overlap other things. So example, Pixel Press makes games. All of the games are driven by camera technology. The whole point of the company is to make apps that take the camera, takes a picture of something and turns it into a game. And almost every single one of those projects, the thing that's been on the critical path has been the camera technology. Our ability to interpret real world objects and make them useful. And so, like Sam says, the game stuff, easy, just leave out this feature, add this one if you have time. But when you're doing something that is cutting edge enough that there are patents on it, keeping other people from doing it, sometimes you just have to accept that this is a 5-month project, and if it takes longer, it's a 6-month project. And so that becomes more of a decision up ahead, whether you want to embark on something that is that risky.
For us, because we do so much client work, like every goal and milestone it's like a moving target. So we use swim lanes to say who should be doing what and when it should be ready. But if we have a bunch of client stuff come up, nothing gets done. It's really easy just to like copy and paste everything down a couple weeks. But what we'll do, because that might keep happening, we're realizing like, okay, we're not really like making any progress. We'll set hard dates. Like, okay, we're gonna have people come in and play the game. We have to have this feature in when they come in and play. If the feature's not in, we just consider the game broken and they can't play it. That forces us to sort of have like, not crunch, because crunch is bad, but a period of like, okay, let's cut distractions, let's like get to work and get stuff in the game. It'll always, it usually gets in there and it's like not fully finished, but it's enough that it's playable, and then we can take that feedback and then polish it for about a week and then move on. And now that thing's done, we can mark it off the list.
Cool. So it's getting pretty late. But I don't want to end it on this. So we're going to do some closing arguments. And you'll have 1 minute each. And to give you time to think about it, I will give my closing arguments because I've come with a conclusion based on what you guys have said and who you are. Okay, here's my
Wait, are you doing
Play
our
along.
arguments for
Just
us?
play along.
No, I'm doing my. I just want to say something, and I need.
Is this when you collaborative game design doc writing?
You're using up my time anyway. Okay. Okay, so here's my 1 minute conclusion. So you guys are all small independent niche developers, and you make small innovative games that were not. I mean, I thought that you guys started with big design documents in some cases, but it sounds like you all kind of went with the flow. And I think that it's those smaller kind of going with the flow, letting the design document evolve over time, that has allowed the indie like movement to kind of grow. Because those huge games with huge design documents that are meant to mitigate risk also keep games from being innovative and kind of doing new things. So, so thankfully, evolving the game over time and prototyping a lot is what's allowed smaller developers to kind of grow up and take over. So, if you've learned anything, maybe that could be it. That's it.
Okay, I got 4 things. Set your vision up front and get everyone on board with a clear direction for what you're trying to do with the game from a business standpoint, for your studio, as well as for the game ready for the day. 2, know how heavy a mechanic will be and your rough ability to lift it onto the game, and if you can actually do that in the time that you're trying to get the game done in. 3, prototype it and iterate a crap load. And then 4, rinse and repeat until you're done and you ran out of money and you need to launch it.
Okay. Wow.
I'd like to take a moment of silence for all those games that will not come out because of the bad advice I've given you guys. But I think it's all about iteration, not only iterating from the perspective of a minimally viable product or a minimal fun product. You need to iterate on your style of communication. Know the tipping point of how much is too much and how little is too little. I know a lot of us don't just struggle with that in games, we struggle with that in everyday life. It's a universal communication thing. Iterate on working with your team. Understand their communication styles also, and figure out how much is too much. Go to game jams, iterate those skills so you know how long something will take. Learn how to scale things up or scale them down. And then, polish or kind of develop an eye for emergent fun, things that just happen to be fun on accident, things that you can include naturally as you make your games.
All right, it's right on time. Bam, go for it.
Alright, so I think what you don't want to do is you don't want to plan games like you would try to plan software because they're not the same. You can't just like, here's a list of features, let's make it. It doesn't work like that because you're trying to plan fun. It's hard to plan that. I think what you do want to do is utilize documents and tools to communicate in a way that's effective for you and for your team, and do it with a purpose. So whether it's pitching, whether it's communicating mechanics or details, managing expectations, working with a client, those are all good reasons to have some kind of a design doc or other tool to utilize your communication.
I think that if you've got a big ambition, you should have a big design document. If you have a smaller ambition, you have a smaller design document. It's pretty simple. You just need it to keep yourself in check and know your goals and your vision for your project, so that it doesn't seep out and consume every facet of your life. And let's see. Yeah, and just like what Rob was saying, open communication is huge. The better you can get with cloud technology and have a way to create, documents that are dynamic and can be changed and worked on by multiple people at the same time, the better. And yeah.
Cool. So, congratulations, or good job, guys. So I have some announcements, and then we'll say thanks to everyone individually. So.